She was fired for saving a U.S. Marine. 24 hours later, the president called her to the White House. But the real question is not how her life changed. It is this: what does it cost to do the right thing when everyone around you chooses fear? Picture a rain-soaked trauma bay in Baltimore just after midnight. Fluorescent lights buzzing. Blood on the gurney. A young nurse with shaking hands and no time left to ask permission. One dying Marine. One order to stand down. One choice that destroys her career before sunrise. This story is more than a twist of fate. It is about duty, conscience, sacrifice, and the moment an ordinary person decides who they really are under pressure. Stay with me to the end and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. That morning, with the black SUVs and the Secret Service at Claire Donovan's door, did not begin in Washington. It began 14 hours earlier under hard rain and cold white lights inside Harborview Regional Trauma Center in Baltimore. By 11:40 on a Thursday night, the emergency department already felt like it had lived through 3 separate disasters. Rain battered the ambulance bay doors in restless waves. Water ran in shining ribbons down the narrow panes of reinforced glass. Every few minutes, the wind shoved against the building hard enough to make the metal frames groan. Inside, the air smelled like antiseptic overheated wiring, stale coffee, and the sharp, copper trace of blood that never fully left a trauma center no matter how often the floors were scrubbed. Monitors chirped from every direction. A child was crying 2 curtains over. Somebody in Exam 6 was throwing up into a plastic basin. A man with a fractured wrist kept asking the same question every 60 seconds because pain had hollowed out his patience. 2 nurses were hunting for an open pump. A resident was standing at a computer with his hair sticking up like he had forgotten he still had a body attached to his shift, and moving through the middle of all of it was Claire. She was not the loudest nurse on the floor, not the one people noticed first. At Harborview, the loud ones usually got noticed for the wrong reasons. Claire was the one everyone looked for without saying her name. The one who could walk into a room with blood on the sheets and panic in the air and somehow make everyone inside it believe there was still a sequence to follow. She pressed a gloved hand against an old dock worker's arm while taping an IV line in place. "You keep flexing like that, and I'm billing your biceps separately." The old man let out a pained snort. "You people charge for jokes now, only the good ones." A younger nurse beside her still knew enough to look surprised by every crisis passed her the saline flush with trembling fingers. Claire took it without comment, finished securing the line, then looked up at the patient. "You work the harbor. 30 years. Then this isn't the ugliest night you've seen." The man shook his head once. "Not even close." "Good," Claire said. "Then let's not get dramatic now." He laughed again, softer this time, and some of the fear left his face. That was how she did it. Not with speeches, not with the kind of confidence people performed for attention. Claire worked like someone building a bridge one board at a time, while everybody else argued about the river. At the central station, Marlene Brooks, charge nurse and unofficial ruler of chaos, was flipping through patient charts with one hand and drinking coffee that looked old enough to vote with the other. Marlene was in her 50s, broad-shouldered, sharp-eyed, and impossible to impress. She glanced up as Claire approached. "How bad?" Claire reached for a chart, skimmed 2 lines, handed it back. "Exam 4 needs imaging. The kid with the concussion is still vomiting. Mr. Kowalski in 6 is trying to negotiate with his blood pressure. And the resident in trauma is 1 dropped chart away from a spiritual collapse." Marlene snorted. "That narrows it down to all of them." Claire brushed a loose strand of dark hair behind her ear. "Do we still not have Dr. Heller?" "Stuck upstairs in emergency surgery." "Patel. Flooding on 95. 25 minutes out if God likes him." Claire glanced toward the ceiling as if considering whether now was the right time to ask God for a staffing adjustment. Then she reached into the pocket of her scrubs, pulled out a peppermint, unwrapped it, and dropped it into her mouth. Marlene watched her. "That your 3rd? 2nd. That's your 4th. Claire gave her a look. I need one authority figure per shift and I'm already over quota. Marlene's mouth twitched, but only barely. With anyone else, it might have passed for annoyance. With Marlene, it was affection. The overhead intercom crackled with a page for respiratory. Somewhere down the hall, a patient started shouting for pain medication. A tech hurried past pushing a portable monitor. Claire turned to move, but Marlene caught her wrist lightly. "You good?" Claire glanced down at the hand, then back up. "I'm vertical." That wasn't the question. Claire hesitated for half a breath. That was all Marlene ever needed. She had worked with Claire long enough to read the places between answers. "My landlord called," Claire said. Again. "Raise. Rent." Marlene winced. "Baltimore's getting ambitious." Claire gave a dry smile. "He says if I want charm, I should appreciate the exposed pipes. Did you tell him they don't count as charm when they sweat in July?" I was too busy being grateful for the mold with personality. Marlene shook her head. "Take an extra shift Saturday." "I already have one." "Then take mine Sunday night." Claire started to protest. Marlene shut that down with a look. "You'll pay me back by not collapsing on hospital property. I hate paperwork." Claire let out a breath that was almost a laugh. "Fine." And Claire, "Yeah, go sit for 5 minutes before something new explodes." Claire looked around the department. "You said that like a challenge." Marlene pointed toward the break room. 5 minutes. Claire obeyed because Marlene was one of the few people on Earth she obeyed without wasting energy pretending otherwise. The break room was less a room than a narrow box, with 2 dented lockers, a table that wobbled on one leg, and a vending machine that sounded asthmatic when it dispensed anything. Claire sat for exactly 40 seconds before reaching for her phone. 3 texts. One from her younger brother asking if she was still coming to their mother's place Sunday. One from an unknown number about an overdue utility payment. One old voicemail she had never deleted from her father, recorded years ago, grainy with static and distant engine noise. She did not play it. She never played it at work. But she looked at the icon long enough to feel the familiar pinch in her chest. Her father had been a fire captain in Annapolis. He used to say the same thing every time he got called out in bad weather. When people need help, they do not care what your plan was for the evening. Claire locked the phone and slipped it back into her pocket just as the break room door swung open. A nurse aide stuck her head in. "They need you in 7. The psych hold is trying to leave." Claire stood. Of course he is. By 11:55, the storm had gotten worse. Water hammered the roof in a steady assault. Lightning flashed behind the windows, turning the hallway walls white for a second at a time. The hospital generators did not kick in, but everyone noticed the lights flicker once and then steady themselves again. The kind of flicker that made every machine in the building feel vulnerable. Claire spent the next 20 minutes moving from room to room with practiced economy. She talked a teenager through stitches on a split eyebrow. She pressed on an abdomen and read pain through posture before the patient could name it. She corrected a medication dosage without embarrassing the intern who almost made the mistake. She helped an elderly woman call her daughter because fear made old age feel colder. All night she had the sensation that the whole department was leaning forward on the balls of its feet, waiting for impact. At 12:14, impact arrived. The double ambulance bay doors slammed open with such force that both security guards at the desk snapped around. Wind knifed into the corridor, cold and wet, and carrying the smell of diesel harbor water and rain-soaked concrete. 2 paramedics burst through with a gurney. Everything after that happened fast, but the first image burned itself into Claire's mind in perfect detail. A man of about 25 on the stretcher, unconscious, soaked, shirt cut open, skin caked with road grime and blood. One side of his chest dark with saturation, burn marks across the shoulder, mud on his boots, a face so swollen and streaked that it was impossible to place him as anything except damaged. The lead paramedic was breathing hard as he shouted the report. Male, mid-20s, unresponsive on contact, severe thoracic trauma, possible blast injury, found near the south shipping yards, pulse weak and thready, pressure dropping, oxygen 82 and falling. We need trauma now. The entire front end of the ER shifted. Marlene was already moving. Bay 3. A resident stepped in with a clipboard. Any ID. The paramedic shook his head once. Nothing in pockets. No wallet, no phone. Claire reached the gurney and took one look at the patient's chest before the paramedics even cleared the doors. Blood soaked through makeshift dressings on the left side. His breathing was shallow and uneven, one side of the rib cage rising a fraction later than the other. The kind of asymmetry that made experienced people move faster without needing words. She leaned in, fingers checking the neck for distension, eyes scanning for entry points, exit wounds patterns. Then she saw it. A silver chain half buried under blood and torn fabric. Without thinking, she hooked a gloved finger beneath it and pulled it free. A military dog tag swung into the fluorescent light. L. Mercer, USMC. For 1 second, the whole hallway seemed to pause around those 4 letters. The resident's voice changed. Marine. One of the security guards stepped closer. Did dispatch say military? The second paramedic lowered his voice, and that made everyone lean in harder. Scene was messy. Harbor police were there. Then some federal people rolled up. No uniforms, no details. We were told to transport immediately and maintain until further instruction. Claire looked at him sharply. Further instruction from who? The paramedic gave the kind of helpless shrug that only field crews gave inside hospitals. Nobody said. The patient made a wet, choking sound. That ended the debate for Claire. She turned toward Bay 3 and started pushing. A voice cut across the room. Stop. Judith Sloan. She appeared from the admin corridor in a charcoal suit that looked too dry for the weather outside, with Richard Vale from Hospital Legal half a step behind her. It was not normal for either of them to be in the emergency department at this hour, which meant this case had outrun normal before it even reached the door. Judith held one palm up. No invasive intervention until we get clearance. Marlene stared at her. He's crashing. I'm aware of that. Claire looked from Judith to Richard, as if she had misheard the English language. Richard stepped forward, expression arranged into professional concern. This patient may be connected to an active federal operation. Until jurisdiction is clarified, we maintain airway support and observation only. Claire blinked once. Observation. Judith kept her voice level. We do not remove embedded material, we do not alter forensic evidence, and we do not proceed beyond stabilization. Claire pointed to the blood pumping through soaked gauze. This is not stabilization. This is a countdown. The patient's monitor gave a jagged alarm. Heart rate climbing. Pressure falling. A trauma tech at the door said systolic in the 70s. The resident swallowed hard. He needs a surgeon. He needs a decision, Claire said. Richard turned toward her. Ms. Donovan stepped back. She did not. The world narrowed in the way it sometimes did for her in critical moments. Sound did not disappear, but it arranged itself by usefulness. The rain became background. The voices became shape and distance. The monitor became the center. She looked at the patient again. Young. Strong build. Dirt ground into his knuckles. A fresh tear through the fabric at the shoulder where something sharp had punched through. Blood gathering beneath him faster than the absorbent pad could drink it up. No one knew who he was. No one knew why he had ended up near the shipping yards. No one could explain why federal people had hovered at the scene and then vanished into silence, but the body on the stretcher was not mysterious to Claire. A body like this said the same thing every other body said in a trauma room. Help me now or lose me. Marlene moved closer, voice low. Claire. It was not a warning, it was a question. Claire answered it by placing her hand on the stretcher rail. Judith's tone sharpened. That is a direct instruction. Claire finally looked at her. Then give me one I can live with. Judith's jaw tightened. You are not cleared to run this case. Claire glanced toward Bay 3, toward the open doors, toward the monitor shrieking over the patient's shoulder. He'll be dead before your clearance gets here. Richard stepped in. This is bigger than you understand. Claire's eyes flashed. No, this is smaller. This is one man bleeding out in front of us. There it was. The line nobody wanted to cross because once someone crossed it, everyone else had to decide who they were. The resident looked trapped between fear and training. A tech froze with a suction kit in hand. Marlene stared at Judith, then at Claire, then at the patient. The Marine let out another broken breath. Claire moved. She pushed the gurney forward. Trauma, Bay 3 now. For one suspended heartbeat, nobody followed. Then Marlene grabbed the oxygen bag and moved with her. The tech swung the bay doors wide. The resident cursed under his breath and hurried after them. Judith's voice snapped across the floor. "Claire Donovan, stop immediately." Claire kept going. The wheels rattled over the threshold into the trauma bay. Bright, surgical light poured down over blood steel in urgency. Claire stripped on a fresh pair of gloves as the team transferred the patient to the bed. "Cut the rest of his shirt. I want suction ready. Call for chest tube tray. Massive transfusion protocol." The resident stared at her. "We don't have attending coverage yet." Claire turned her head just enough for him to see her eyes. "Then, be useful until we do." He swallowed. "Right." A nurse tech clipped the monitor leads into place. Oxygen 79. Marlene was already bagging air-forcing life into damaged lungs by hand. "Come on, sweetheart," she muttered at the patient as if she had known him for years. "Not on my floor." Claire leaned over the chest wounds and parted the blood with gauze. There were at least 2 clear penetration sites and a raised deformation higher up near the ribs, where metal seemed to be lodged beneath the skin. The left side of the chest looked tight wrong, not expanding enough. She pressed lightly, listening, watching. "Absent breath sounds on the left," she said. The resident, Evan Pike, according to the badge on his scrub top, moved to her side. He was young, maybe 30, bright enough to know how scared he should be. "You think tension. I think if you keep asking me questions before handing me what I need, I'm going to hand you to orthopedics in pieces." A flicker of understanding crossed his face. Good. Fear was fine. Panic was useless. He turned. Needle decompression kit, now. At the door, Judith remained planted like an accusation. Richard had taken out his phone, probably documenting every second that could later be used against Claire. She felt that fact and shoved it aside. Fear about consequences took up the same space as focus, and she had no room left. The Marine's head rolled weakly to one side. For an instant, his eyelids fluttered not enough for consciousness, just enough to reveal a sliver of dark iris before he disappeared again. Claire heard herself speak before she realized she was doing it. "Stay with me." Nobody reacted. Good. There was no time for anyone's opinion of tenderness. The needle went in. Pressure vented. A rush of trapped air escaped with a wet hiss. The monitor jumped, then dipped again. Marlene exhaled through her teeth. Better, but not enough. It won't be. Claire extended a hand, tube. Evan hesitated 1 second too long. Claire snapped her fingers once. He put the instrument into her palm. Outside the bay, someone from security said hospital admin says you need to stop. Marlene did not turn around. Hospital admin can hold pressure if they feel that strongly. The tech at the monitor called out new vitals. None of them were good. Claire worked with steady hands and a spine full of adrenaline. Every movement had a purpose. Every second mattered. The trauma bay felt less like a room now and more like a thin line held against collapse. The rain kept hitting the windows. The fluorescent lights kept humming. And in the middle of that hard white brightness, Claire Donovan chose again and again not to let go. By the time the first blood bag was hung, the entire department knew the same thing. This was no longer a routine emergency. This was a fight. And once the room crossed that line, there was no returning to caution dressed up as policy. Trauma, a Bay 3 sealed around them like the inside of a storm shelter. The doors swung shut. The noise from the main floor dropped to a dull wash beyond the glass. Inside the bay, everything sharpened. Light, metal, breath, blood. The monitor over the bed threw jagged green spikes across the screen, each one more fragile than the last. Claire stood at the patient's left side with both hands red to the wrists, gauze packed deep against the wound, while Dr. Evan Pike fought the chest tube into position under her direction. "Lower," she said. Evan adjusted. "Not into the floor, into the pocket. Feel the resistance and follow it." His jaw tightened. "I know. You're thinking. Stop thinking." Marlene was at the head of the bed, forcing oxygen through the bag valve mask with steady, brutal rhythm. She means panic slower. A trauma tech cut away the last of the soaked clothing and tossed it into a stainless basin. Wet fabric hit metal with a slap. Another nurse spiked a new line and called for more units from blood bank. The first bag was already draining into the patient's arm, ruby dark against the clear tubing. Claire pressed harder. Warm blood forced itself between her fingers. "He is still leaking," she said. "No kidding," Marlene muttered. The patient's chest rose under the mask, then faltered. The left side lagged behind, stubborn and shallow. His skin had gone beyond pale into that gray waxy shade that made every clinician in the room feel the clock with their own skin. Evan glanced at the monitor. Pressure still dropping. How far? 68/38. Claire looked at the wound field again. The blast injuries were messy ugly, in a way bullets often were not. Metal had gone where it pleased. Torn muscle, burned edges, blood where blood had no right to collect. Something had struck him close and hard. Not shrapnel from a distant scene, not random debris from a traffic wreck. This was violence that had reached in with both hands. "Lift his shoulder," she told the tech. The tech did. Claire leaned closer and found another puncture track tucked beneath the angle of the upper ribs where the blood had hidden it. "There," she said. "We missed one." Evan swore under his breath. "Good," Claire said. "That means you can still learn." He shot her a look that would have been offended if fear had not eaten most of his extra energy. At the door, Judith Sloane's reflection passed across the glass. She was still there. So was Richard Vale. Their silhouettes were rigid like people attending a funeral before the body had the courtesy to die. Claire shut them out. "Clamp," she said. A steel instrument landed in her hand. She worked by feel as much as sight, searching through blood and tissue, while the room moved around her in hard, efficient bursts. "Second unit is here. Hang it. Portable chest x-ray in 30 seconds. Too slow. The surgeon is 5 minutes out. That is a fantasy number." Evan adjusted the tube again, then finally looked up. "I've got drainage." Dark blood surged down the tube in a hot, sudden rush. The monitor steadied for 1 breath, 2, then the heart rate kicked wild again. Claire's eyes snapped to the screen. "He's not filling." Marlene's gaze met hers over the patient's face. Pericardial. Claire hated the possibility the second it entered the room. She felt at the neck. Watched the chest. Read the body the way other people read weather. There was pressure somewhere hidden and rising. Blood that had gone where it should not, pooling in a place that turned the heart into a trapped fist. Maybe. Evan swallowed. "We need ultrasound." "Then get me one." A nurse at the cart said battery died in room 9. Marlene closed her eyes for half a second. Of course it did. Claire did not look away from the patient. Manual exam. Keep him alive long enough for us to be right. Outside, thunder rolled low across the harbor. Inside, the trauma bay became a place where nobody had the luxury of dignity. Sweat ran down temples. Masks shifted damp against skin. Gowns stuck to backs. Someone knocked over a tray, and nobody spared the sound a glance. Blood smeared the floor in half-moon arcs under their shoes. Evan's hands hovered above the chest, uncertain for the first time since he had committed himself to the case. Claire caught it immediately. "Doctor." His head jerked up. "Look at me." He did. "You are in the room now." He blinked once. "He is not dead," Claire said. Evan nodded hard. "He is not dead." "Good, then act like it." The resident at the computer station called out lab values as they appeared. Hemoglobin dropping. Lactate climbing. Blood gases ugly. Each number another small betrayal. Marlene gave the patient another breath, name. Nobody answered. Not because they did not hear her. Because the truth was sitting right there in all of them, and nobody wanted to be the one to say it first. The dog tag. The initials. The Marine. Claire had tucked the tag into the pocket of her scrub top during the transfer without even noticing she had done it. Now she felt its cool edge against her sternum every time she leaned over the bed. A small weight. A human detail. Proof that there was a person under all this damage, not just a body the institution wanted frozen in paperwork. The patient gave a weak convulsion through the shoulders. Then the rhythm on the screen went ragged. "Damn it," Claire said. "He's slipping." The respiratory therapist arrived at last, damp from the rain, carrying intubation equipment, and a look that said he had run the whole way from another unit. What did I miss? Everything Marlene said. Tube him. The therapist moved into place at the head beside her. Claire shifted just enough to give room, never lifting pressure from the wound. A sedative was pushed. The laryngoscope went in. For 3 tense seconds, the room narrowed to the angle of the airway, the hiss of oxygen, the line on the screen. Then the tube passed. "Confirmed," the therapist said. Marlene exhaled once through her nose and handed over the bag. "Congratulations. You are the new face of breathing." That earned the smallest flicker of laughter from the tech, which vanished the instant the monitor shrieked again. Evan's head snapped toward the screen. Pressure is crashing. "How bad?" 52. Claire packed deeper into the wound and felt blood well up around her fingers faster than before. "We need the surgeon now." As if the room had heard her, the doors burst open and Dr. Heller came in, still wearing a surgical cap from upstairs, face-flushed gloves half on. He took one glance at the monitor, one glance at the chest, and all the distance between floors collapsed into action. Report. Evan started too fast. Male, mid-20s, probable blast trauma. Thoracic involvement. Chest tube left side hypotensive on arrival. Transient improvement, now unstable with ongoing blood loss and possible tamponade. Heller stepped to the bedside. "Who started?" Claire answered without looking up. "I did." He registered her voice, the blood on her hands, the absence of anyone else holding the line, and chose not to waste 1 second on hierarchy. "What have you got?" "Penetrating wound here. Another track under the shoulder. Tube is draining. He is still not holding pressure." Heller laid fingers against the chest, read the scene in silence, then looked at Evan. "Prep for pericardial window if we need it." Evan stared. "Here?" Heller's expression did not change. "Do you see an operating room?" That shut every remaining door between them and the truth. This was no longer a case waiting for perfect conditions. This was field medicine with better lighting. Claire moved to the next task before anyone told her. More suction. Warm fluids. "Call blood bank again. We are going through what we have." Outside the bay, Judith opened the door a fraction. "Dr. Heller, I need a word." He turned his head just enough to see her. "No. This patient may involve federal restrictions." Heller did not raise his voice. He did not need to. "This patient involves blood in my trauma bay." He shut the door with his elbow and returned to the bed. Claire felt something dark and fierce move through her chest. Not triumph, relief. The kind that came when one more person in the room chose the patient before the institution. For the next 20 minutes, time lost its shape. There was only the sequence. Clamp, suction, pressure, blood, numbers, commands. The trauma bay clock ticked across 1:12, then 1:20, then 1:30, but the room lived outside normal time now. Every second expanded under strain and then vanished before anyone could own it. Heller worked with blunt concentration sweat collecting under the rim of his cap. Evan mirrored him as best he could, less shaky now, his fear distilled into movement. Marlene held the room together with curt instructions and insults that functioned like glue. The techs moved where needed before words fully formed. Claire never stopped. She switched hands when the first forearm started to cramp. She recalculated drips in her head without looking down. She saw every shift in the patient's face, every failure in color, every tiny hint that a body still wanted to stay. At 1:46, the rhythm dropped out. No warning. No dramatic final speech from the machine. Just a flat, hard tone that cut the room clean in half. For an instant, nobody moved, because human beings always need that first stolen fraction of a second to accept what their eyes are telling them. Then Claire heard her own voice crack across the silence. Start compressions. Evan climbed onto the stool and began. His palms drove into the sternum with brutal measured force. The whole body rocked under the pressure. Push episode. Epi in. Charge. The crash cart rolled closer. Paddles were prepped. The smell of gel and ozone slipped into the room. Marlene counted under her breath. 1 and 2 and 3 and 4. Claire stood at the side of the bed, breathing too fast behind her mask, one gloved hand pressed against the rail so hard her knuckles blanched under the latex. She had seen people die before. That was not the terror. The terror was this particular man dying after she had dragged everyone in the room across the line for him. After she had put her name, her license, and whatever fragile future she still had under the heel of this decision. Not because he was a Marine, not because of the tag. Because she had said yes with her whole body when the room said wait. And if he died now, she would still know she had been right, but right would feel unbearably small. Clear. The shock hit him. His body arched once and dropped. Nothing. Resume. Compressions again. The rain slammed against the glass. Judith and Richard were still visible beyond the bay, ghosted by fluorescent glare, trapped in the role of witnesses to the thing they had tried to prevent and the thing they had nearly allowed. Charge again. Claire leaned in close to the patient's ear, not caring whether anyone heard her. Listen to me. You do not get to leave after making me torch my life for you. Marlene shot her a quick look and then back to the count. Claire kept talking. I do not know your first name. I do not know who is waiting for you. I do not know what happened to you out there. But I know you fought this long, so you fight longer. Another shock. The line trembled, then flattened again. Evan's compression slowed a fraction from exhaustion. Heller stepped in and took over without a word. The older doctor drove down, hard, every motion precise and merciless. Sweat ran off his jaw onto the sheet. The respiratory therapist murmured oxygen numbers that no one wanted to hear. Claire looked at the chest wound and saw a fresh seep, slower now but still there. The body was giving way in layers. Again, she said. Claire Evans started. Again. They shocked him a third time. The body jumped, fell, held. Nothing. The room was full of breathing and machine noise and a terror so focused it became stillness. Then, beneath the hard flat tone, a single blip appeared. Small, stubborn. Then another. The monitor stuttered back into an unstable rhythm. Marlene stopped counting. Nobody spoke for 1 second because language would have cheapened the shock of it. Then the tech at the monitor said very softly, "We have him. Not one, not saved, not stable. Just back." Claire felt all the muscles in her body unlock at once and almost buckle her knees. She caught herself on the rail and kept moving. "Do not slow down," Heller said, as if he had heard the weakness in the room before it could spread. No one did. They pushed forward. New blood went in. The rhythm held ugly but present. Pressure clawed its way upward by degrees so miserable they still looked beautiful compared to dead. Heller pressed gauze to the upper wound and looked at Claire. "Who found the second track?" "I did." He nodded once. Good eye. Coming from Heller, that was nearly an embrace. Claire barely heard it. At 2:17, a portable X-ray finally arrived and was wheeled in by a tech who looked like he regretted every life choice that had led him into the room. Plates slid behind the patient. Images flashed onto the screen in grainy whites and shadows. Heller leaned in. There, he said. Metal. At least 2 visible fragments. One lodged near soft tissue. Another angled deeper, dangerously close to where danger became catastrophe. Evan swore again, this time with more conviction than panic. How is he still alive? Claire answered before she thought better of it. Because he has not had permission to die yet. Marlene barked a laugh that sounded halfway to tears. The room kept going. By 3:05, the first edge of fatigue began to show in earnest. Shoulders ached, backs tightened. The adrenaline that had sharpened everyone now threatened to become shakiness if they let it. Claire could feel a tremor creeping into her hands whenever she stopped moving for more than 2 seconds. She did not stop moving. The storm outside eased from violent assault to steady rain. Beyond the windows, the black of night started to thin by degrees too subtle to name. The city was inching toward morning, but inside Bay 3 there was still no such thing as time except the numbers that mattered: heart rate, pressure, oxygen, drainage, output, response. At 3:22, Logan Mercer, though nobody in the room knew his full name yet, developed a run of arrhythmia that twisted everyone's nerves into wire again. Heller swore. Marlene reached for medication before Claire could ask. Evan kept one hand at the tube site and the other braced against the mattress as if he could physically hold the body in this world by refusing to step away. The medicine went in. The rhythm shuddered, then settled. A collective exhale moved through the bay. Claire realized she was freezing under her gown, even though sweat had soaked the collar of her scrubs. Her shoes felt wet. She looked down once and saw blood on the floor had dried in dark streaks over the toes. She had no memory of when that happened. At 3:40, Heller finally stepped back enough to read the whole patient instead of one wound at a time. His voice came out rough from disuse. He has a chance. No one answered because chance was not an outcome. Chance was an opening. Claire adjusted the transfusion rate and looked at the face on the bed. With the swelling and blood cleaned back enough to see him properly, he looked younger. Not like a boy. Not soft. But young in the way strong men looked when injury stripped them of performance. There was a scar near the jaw she had not noticed before. Another small one above the brow. Somebody had cut his hair close a week or so earlier. His eyelashes were unexpectedly dark against skin gone pale. There were people somewhere who knew this face in sunlight. There were people who knew his laugh, what food he ordered when he had a choice, whether he called his mother, whether he was late, whether he sang badly in the car, whether he slept on his stomach, whether he had ever said aloud that he was afraid. All of that ordinary life sat invisibly in the room with them. Claire had always hated how hospitals erased context. One moment a person existed inside a whole architecture of love and memory. The next they were a case number and a blood type and a room assignment. Not tonight. Tonight he was still unknown, but he was not generic. At 4:11, after nearly 3 straight hours of controlled war, Heller made the call to transfer him to surgical intensive care, rather than risk moving him again before he could truly tolerate it. The worst of the immediate crisis had passed. The room loosened one notch. That was when the tremor in Claire's hands became impossible to ignore. Marlene saw it first. Of course she did. Sit. Claire shook her head. Sit before I make it humiliating. I am fine. Marlene pointed to the rolling stool with 2 fingers. You are vertical through spite. That is not the same thing. Claire looked at the patient again, then finally obeyed. She sat. The stool felt unstable under her, as if the floor had shifted without warning. The adrenaline drop hit her so hard she had to fight the urge to lean over and put her head between her knees. Evan sank against the counter and scrubbed one hand over his face, leaving a smear of red along his cheek. Heller stripped off one pair of gloves and reached for another. No one writes anything until I have spoken to all of you. Richard Vale's voice came through the partially opened door. Doctor Administration will require immediate statements. Heller did not even turn around. Administration can require a priest. Even in exhaustion, that earned another thin flash of laughter from Marlene. Claire pressed both hands against her thighs and forced herself to breathe slowly. The room around her had the wrecked stillness of a place that had held against collapse and knew it. Blood bags hung near empty. Used wrappers littered the counters. Sharp spins were half full. The floor needed a mop, the trays needed restocking, and every person in the room looked older than they had at midnight. The patient's monitor now gave a weak but regular rhythm, a sound so beautiful in its plainness, Claire almost wanted to close her eyes and listen to it without interruption. She did not realize the dog tag had slid partly from her pocket until Marlene glanced down and saw the chain. You keeping souvenirs now? Claire looked down, startled, and tucked it back in. "I forgot it was there." Marlene's expression softened. "No, you did not." Claire had no energy left for denial. At 4:27, while the room was still cleaning around the edges of survival, the patient stirred. It began so lightly that only Claire noticed. A flicker at the throat, a tension through the jaw. Her eyes snapped to his face. "Hold on." Everyone stilled. His eyelids trembled once, then lifted. Not fully, not cleanly, just enough. The eyes that opened were dark, clouded with pain and sedation, but conscious for one raw, fragile instant. He looked without comprehension at the lights above him, at the blur of movement at the oxygen line, then finally at Claire, where she sat nearest his left side. For that second, the whole room disappeared. It was not cinematic, not grand, no swelling music, just two human beings meeting through the wreckage. His mouth moved. Claire leaned closer until she could feel the warmth of the ventilated breath against her cheek. "What?" The word barely formed. "Thanks." That was all. A whisper made of air and exhaustion. Then his eyes closed again, and he drifted back under. Claire stayed there a moment longer than she needed to. One hand braced on the rail, something deep in her chest pulling tight and then loosening all at once. She had not realized how badly she needed proof that the man on the bed was truly still in there. Now she had it. Marlene looked away, giving her the privacy of not being watched. Evan stared at the floor. Even Heller's face changed just slightly, as if the room had been granted something it did not deserve. Claire stood slowly. Her knees protested. She stripped off her gloves and dropped them into the bin. They landed wet and heavy among the others. For the first time all night there was nothing in her hands. No gauze, no instrument, no line to tape or number to chase. Just emptiness and the pulse of her own blood in her wrists. The silence that followed was not complete. Machines still hummed, shoes still moved, rain still fell beyond the window, but the violence had gone out of the room. It had become aftermath. Claire stepped back from the bed and looked down at the Marine whose life had filled the last 4 hours like fire. Alive, not safe, not simple, alive. The fact struck her with such force that her throat closed around it. She pressed 2 fingers briefly to the bridge of her nose, then lowered her hand before anyone could mistake the gesture for fragility. A nurse entered with fresh linens for transfer. Another began documenting medication times with the shaky concentration of someone writing after battle. Evan pushed away from the counter and came to stand beside Claire. "I thought we lost him." She kept her eyes on the bed. "So did I." He gave a humorless laugh. "I have never been that scared in my life." Claire turned to him then, taking in the blood on his cheek. The sweat dried into his hairline, the stunned look of somebody who had stepped across a threshold and knew there was no uncrossing it. "That means you were paying attention." He held her gaze for a second. "You made the call before any of us." She said nothing, because there it was. The sentence that mattered. Not praise, not blame, fact. You made the call. Around them, the room reset in fragments. A supply cart squeaked. A monitor cable was replaced. The blood-stained drape was folded inward on itself and carried away. Outside the trauma bay, the eastern edge of the world had begun to pale behind the rain. Morning was coming to Baltimore, whether anyone in this room felt ready for it or not. Claire reached absently into her pocket and touched the dog tag again. Cold metal, warm skin beneath it. A living man in the bed. A hospital full of people who had watched her choose him over policy. That was when she felt it sharp and certain before a single word had been spoken. The cost. Not hypothetical anymore, not looming, real. It sat just outside the door in a dry suit and polished shoes. Claire lifted her head. Judith Sloan was still standing in the doorway. She had not moved much in the last 4 hours, yet somehow she seemed more settled now than she had at any point during the emergency. While everyone inside Trauma Bay 3 wore the wreckage of the night on their bodies, Judith looked almost untouched by it. Her blouse was still crisp, her hair still pinned in place, her expression still arranged into that same careful severity hospital administrators seemed to learn before they ever learned compassion. Richard Vale stood beside her with a legal pad tucked under one arm. His tie slightly loosened now, though the gesture only made him look like a man trying to imitate fatigue rather than live inside it. Between them and the room, the patient's monitor kept its fragile rhythm. Claire met Judith's eyes for one quiet second, then looked away first not from surrender but from instinct. The Marine in the bed mattered more than whatever was waiting at the door. Marlene stripped off her gloves and tossed them into the bin. "He needs ICU transfer in the next 10 minutes. Heller nodded. "I want him monitored every second between here and the unit. If his pressure drops, you call me before the line finishes ringing." Even was already moving to update the chart. His hands had steadied now that the worst was over, but his face still carried that stunned, hollowed look people wore after a room chose life by inches. Richard cleared his throat from the doorway. "Ms. Donovan." Claire did not answer. He tried again. "Ms. Donovan, administration needs to speak with you immediately." Marlene turned first, immediately. Judith kept her tone smooth. "Now that the patient is no longer in immediate danger, yes. No longer in immediate danger." The phrase entered the room like cold water, as if they had simply held a conference around him, as if hands had not cramped and backs had not screamed, and fear had not stood in every corner. Heller straightened and looked at Judith with the unblinking stare of a surgeon who had neither patience nor ambition for institutional theater. "She just spent 4 hours holding a human heart on this side of the wall," he said. "You can wait 10 minutes. Judith did not blink. "Dr. Heller, this matter involves severe procedural violations." Heller peeled off his second pair of gloves. "Then write me in too." Richard gave a tight, almost pained smile. "Your involvement is noted, Doctor. This discussion concerns Ms. Donovan's conduct." Claire finally spoke. Her voice came out tired, low-scraped raw by adrenaline and sleeplessness. "My conduct." Judith's eyes settled on her. "Your actions, yes." Claire glanced at the bed once more. The Marine's face was calmer now beneath oxygen and sedation. The swelling had not gone down, but the violence of the first arrival had been replaced by something quieter. He looked less like a body dragged through a storm and more like somebody sleeping badly after a war. She looked at Marlene. "Stay with him. Try and stop me." Claire nodded once, then stepped out of the trauma bay. The hallway air felt colder than the room she had just left. The fluorescent lights overhead seemed too bright now that she was no longer moving fast enough to outrun thought. Her shoulders ached. Her hands throbbed. Her scrub top had dried stiff where blood had soaked into the fabric. She could feel sweat cooling along her spine. Every part of her body had begun to register the price of the night. Judith turned and gestured down the corridor. "My office." Claire followed because it was easier than arguing in front of security and staff, and because she knew exactly how these people liked their cruelty delivered. Privately. Professionally. With the door closed and language polished until harm looked procedural. They walked past treatment rooms and supply closets and windows still streaked with rain. The storm had weakened outside, but the sky remained the color of old metal. Somewhere overhead, the first helicopter of morning chopped across the city, its low mechanical thrum vibrating faintly through the walls. The hospital was changing shifts. Night staff moved like people returning from a hard country. Day staff arrived with coffee in hand and questions in their eyes, reading the damage in faces before anyone said a word. Claire caught a few glances as she passed, some sympathetic, some cautious. Some already distant. News traveled fast in hospitals. Judith's office sat behind a glass door near administration, far enough from the emergency department to make suffering feel abstract. Inside, everything was arranged for confidence. Framed credentials, dark wood shelves, a plant that had never once looked thirsty. Leather chairs too stiff to invite honesty. Richard held the door open. Claire went in and remained standing. Judith took her seat first. Richard sat beside her and opened his legal pad to a blank page. Judith folded her hands on the desk. "Please sit." Claire stayed where she was. No. A flicker crossed Judith's face, not surprise, mild irritation that the script had shifted one line off what she preferred. "As you wish," she said. Silence settled, the kind built to make the other person uncomfortable first. Claire had spent too many nights with screaming patients and flatlining monitors to fear silence in an office. Judith began. "What occurred in Trauma Bay 3 tonight was extraordinary in scope and seriousness." Claire did not answer. Judith continued. "You initiated invasive procedures on a federally sensitive patient without clearance, overrode direct administrative instruction, encouraged subordinate staff to disregard protocol, and expose this institution to substantial liability." Claire let the words sit for a moment, turning them over as if trying to decide whether they belonged to the same species as what had just happened down the hall. Then she said he was dying. Richard stepped in gently, the way lawyers often did when they wanted to sound reasonable while laying down the blade. "That does not change the legal framework surrounding an unidentified military patient, possibly tied to an active federal matter." Claire looked at him. Legal framework. Yes, he had blood filling his chest. Richard's expression did not move. And had this institution interfered improperly with a protected federal case, we could have faced catastrophic consequences. The exhaustion in Claire's body sharpened into anger so clean it almost steadied her. He was not a case. He was a man. Judith's tone cooled another degree. "That distinction is not relevant here." Claire laughed then. Not loudly, just once, a short, unbelieving sound. "It is the only relevant distinction." Neither of them liked that. She could see it. The annoyance that came whenever grief or urgency refused to stay in the tidy boxes administration assigned to them. Judith opened a folder on the desk. Claire recognized her employee file immediately from the color tab and the hospital letterhead. All those years of evaluations and shift records and continuing education credits condensed into paper. "You are an excellent nurse," Judith said. "No one disputes that." Richard nodded as if to reinforce the generosity. Claire stared at the folder. "Excellent nurse." Always the phrase that came right before punishment in workplaces that prized compliance over courage. Judith went on. "But healthcare institutions function within systems. Protocol exists to protect patients, personnel, and the integrity of the hospital itself. Last night you chose to ignore that system." Claire's eyes lifted slowly. "No. Last night your system chose to ignore a dying patient." Richard stepped in again. "Ms. Donovan, please understand. This is not a moral judgment." "Yes, it is." He paused. Claire could hear the blood moving in her own ears now. She could feel the dog tag tucked into the pocket of her scrub top pressing lightly against her chest. Cold metal. Silent witness. "You're calling it a violation because he lived long enough to prove you wrong," she said. "If I had stood there and watched him code while you waited for somebody to fax permission, would that have been acceptable conduct?" Judith's mouth hardened. "That is not what happened." It almost was. No one spoke for a few seconds after that. The office hummed faintly with climate control. Somewhere out beyond the glass, a phone rang. A copier whirred. The day was beginning with all the ordinary sounds institutions made while deciding which human beings mattered less than their rules. Judith slid a document across the desk. "Claire Donovan, your employment with Harborview Regional Trauma Center is terminated effective immediately." The words landed with the blunt finality of a dropped instrument. Claire did not move. She had expected discipline. Suspension, maybe. Review. Internal investigation. Something brutal and bureaucratic. But there was still a small stubborn place inside her that had believed reality might protect itself. That a life saved in that way under those circumstances would force even people like Judith Sloan to admit the obvious. It did not. Claire looked down at the paper but did not reach for it. Terminated. Judith's voice stayed calm. "You may contact Human Resources regarding final payroll and benefits continuation." Claire heard the sentence and understood every word individually, but together they drifted for a moment before meaning fully took hold. No more shifts. No more badge access. No more night crews and trauma calls and hard-won respect from people who only respected what worked. Just cut loose. Richard slid a smaller envelope on top of the termination letter. There is also a non-disclosure acknowledgement regarding the patient and the events of tonight. Claire looked at that too, then back at him. You want me to sign something? It is standard. For who? The staff you fire after they save somebody. His face tightened almost imperceptibly. Judith leaned back in her chair. This decision is final. Claire drew in a slow breath. She wanted to shout, to throw the envelope, to drag them by the wrists down to Bay 3 and make them stand in the blood until their language changed. But the anger that had sharpened her during the argument had become something heavier now. Not weaker. Heavier. A deep animal exhaustion with a blade hidden inside it. She looked from Judith to Richard and said quietly, I saved him. Judith's answer came too fast, too polished, and we are grateful the patient survived. Claire's eyes did not leave hers. No, you aren't. For the first time that morning, Judith said nothing. Claire picked up neither paper nor envelope. She turned and walked out. No one tried to stop her. The corridor back toward the emergency department seemed longer now. Dawn had found the windows at last. The rain outside had softened to a fine gray sheet, and the city beyond looked blurred at the edges as if Baltimore itself had not fully opened its eyes. She reached the staff lockers and stopped. Her hands were shaking, not violently, just enough to make the metal latch feel smaller than it should have. She opened the locker and stared into the little square of her life at Harborview. A spare set of scrubs folded on the upper shelf, a half-empty bottle of ibuprofen, a cheap hand lotion she never remembered to use, a packet of peppermints, her stethoscope hanging from the hook, and tucked into the back corner a framed photograph of her father in his Annapolis fire captain dress blues standing by an engine with one hand on his hip, and that crooked half-smile he wore whenever someone told him a rule that got in the way of helping people. Claire took the frame down first, then the stethoscope, then the mints. One item at a time, like dismantling proof that a place had once made room for her. Around her, the locker room moved with the awkward quiet of staff who had heard enough to know where not to look. 2 nurses from the next shift came in talking about bed capacity, saw Claire at her locker, and stopped mid-sentence. One of them offered a small, pained smile that did not quite make it to her eyes. The other looked away so fast it hurt more. Evan appeared in the doorway, still in the same blood-marked scrubs from the trauma bay hair flattened with sweat. Claire. She kept packing. You should get some sleep, doctor. He came closer. I heard. I imagine most of the building has. His face twisted with a kind of helpless anger. This is insane. Claire gave a small shrug. He lowered his voice. If you want, I can write a statement. Heller, too. Marlene, we can say administration ordered a delay. We can document everything. Claire paused then and finally looked at him. There was sincerity there. Fear, too, but sincerity stronger than fear. It touched something in her. It won't change what they already decided. Maybe not. She slipped the stethoscope into her bag. Then keep your energy for him. Evan's jaw worked once. You are the reason he's alive. She looked down at the locker again because there was suddenly too much in her throat. And he is the reason you should stay useful. He did not answer right away. Then he said, I'll still write it. Claire nodded once, not because she thought it mattered, but because she did not want to crush the one honest instinct still standing in this building. When she closed the locker for the last time, the sound was small and final. She slid her badge from the lanyard around her neck and turned it over in her hand. Claire Donovan, R.N. The plastic rectangle had opened doors for years. Night entrances, medication rooms, trauma bays. The break room no one ever really rested in. It had been ordinary enough to become invisible. Now it felt strangely personal, as if the building had spoken to her through it all this time and decided overnight to forget her name. She left the badge on the bench. Outside, the city had fully crossed into morning. The rain had thinned to mist. Cars hissed over wet pavement. A bus wheezed to a stop at the corner and released a handful of tired commuters into the day. Harborview's glass facade reflected a washed-out silver sky. Claire stood on the sidewalk with her tote bag over one shoulder and looked back at the emergency entrance. It was just a building again. Brick, glass, steel. bright doors swallowing and releasing people without memory. A place where she had worked holidays and overnight doubles and shifts so long the hours blurred together. A place where she had eaten crackers standing up and cried exactly twice in the supply closet and laughed more often than most people would guess. A place where she had become the kind of nurse other people trusted in the dark. Now it had shut behind her like she had never belonged to it at all. "All I did," she said under her breath, "was save him." The words disappeared into the wet air. She started walking. The apartment in East Baltimore felt smaller than usual that morning, as if the walls had edged inward while she was gone. It was a narrow third-floor walk-up with old hardwood floors that creaked near the kitchen and windows that rattled when buses passed too fast. The radiator in winter clanged like it held grudges. The sink faucet dripped unless she tightened it past reason. In the summer, the building smelled faintly of dust and fried onions from the first-floor tenant. Normally, the place comforted her. That morning, it just witnessed. Claire kicked off her shoes by the door and set her bag on the table. She stood there for a long time without taking off her scrub top or turning on a light. The room was dim with storm light, blue-gray, and tired. Her body had reached that strange post-shift threshold where she was both exhausted enough to collapse and too charged to rest. She finally moved to the bathroom, switched on the light, and saw herself properly. Dry blood on the sleeve, mascara smudged beneath one eye, a bruise forming along the inside of one wrist where she had braced too hard against the bed rail. She washed her hands again even though she had scrubbed them at the hospital. The water ran pink for a second from traces caught under the nails. She kept washing until the skin looked over clean. When she came back into the main room, she reached into her scrub pocket and pulled out the dog tag. L. Mercer, USMC. The chain lay cold across her palm. She should have turned it over to security, or charted it with personal effects, but in the chaos, it had stayed with her, almost as if some deeper part of her had refused to let the Marine become nameless after all that. She sat on the couch with the tag in one hand and her father's framed photograph in the other, and the apartment went completely still. No television, no music, no voice except the one in her own head replaying the night in jagged pieces. The arrival, the blood, Judith's hand raised in command, the pressure numbers falling off the monitor. The moment the line went flat, the whisper in the trauma bay. "Thanks." Claire set the frame on the table and leaned back against the couch. Her eyes burned, but sleep would not come. Every time she closed them, the room lit up again under surgical lamps. At some point, she must have drifted into something close to unconsciousness, because the next thing she knew, pale morning light had shifted across the floorboards, and a hard knock rattled the front door. Not a neighbor's knock, not the mail, a deliberate knock with no uncertainty in it. Claire sat up too fast and pain flashed behind her eyes. Her neck ached from sleeping crooked against the couch. The dog tag had left a faint impression across her palm where she had fallen asleep holding it. The knock came again. She stood across the room barefoot and peered through the peephole. A dark suit filled most of the frame. She opened the door 3 inches. 3 men stood in the hallway. Dark suits, earpieces. Posture so controlled it looked unnatural in an old apartment building with bad paint and flickering hall lights. The one in front held up credentials. Claire Donovan. It was not a question. Yes, Special Agent Collins, United States Secret Service. Claire stared at the badge, then at his face, then back at the badge. For one absurd second, she wondered whether exhaustion had finally broken something in her. "I think you have the wrong door." "No, ma'am." The hall behind them was full of stillness. She could hear a television faintly through a neighbor's wall. She could hear her own pulse. Agent Collins continued, "The President of the United States has requested your presence in Washington." The sentence was so impossible that Claire almost missed the second half of it. "Requested. Yes, ma'am." She let out a short, disbelieving breath. "I got fired this morning." Agent Collins gave the smallest nod, as if he already knew. "We need to leave now." Claire looked past him toward the front windows at the end of the hall. Through the smeared glass, she could see black vehicles lined along the curb below. not one. Several. Neighbors were already gathering in the half-covert way neighbors did when something extraordinary rolled onto an ordinary block. A teenager in a Ravens hoodie stood frozen on the sidewalk pretending not to stare. Mrs. Alvarez from downstairs held a grocery bag against her hip and openly watched the building with her mouth slightly open. Claire looked down at the dog tag still clutched in her hand. Why? Agent Collins' expression did not change. I am not at liberty to discuss details here. That is not an answer. It is the one I can provide. Claire's fingers tightened around the chain. For a second the hallway fell away, and she was back in the trauma bay staring at the tag under blood and rain and fluorescent glare. L. Mercer. Mercer. Something moved at the edge of her understanding, but refused to settle into place. She looked up sharply. Am I in trouble? The agent's face softened by 1 degree. No, ma'am. That should have calmed her. It did not, because men like this did not show up at a third-floor walk-up in East Baltimore unless something had already shifted far beyond ordinary life. Claire stepped back from the door. I need 2 minutes. You have 2. She moved through the apartment in a kind of waking unreality. A clean blouse from the chair, jeans from the bedroom floor, hair tied back with hands that would not quite stop trembling. She splashed water on her face and stared at herself in the mirror again, trying to find some version of a person who belonged in whatever came after this knock. There was none, so she took the nearest one. At the last second, she slipped the dog tag into her coat pocket. Then she grabbed her bag, locked the apartment, and followed the agents downstairs. Every eye on the block found her. The morning had brightened, but not warmed. The street shone from the earlier rain. Black SUVs idled in a silent line, polished and impossible against the sagging row houses and cracked sidewalk planters. As Claire stepped out, Mrs. Alvarez called from halfway down the stoop. Claire. Honey, are you all right? Claire opened her mouth and realized she had no language for the scene in front of her. I think so, she said, because anything more truthful would have sounded insane. One of the rear doors opened for her. The interior of the vehicle smelled new and expensive in a way that made her suddenly aware of the hospital blood still caught in the seams of her overnight bag. She slid inside. Agent Collins took the seat across from her. Another agent sat in front speaking quietly into a mic near his collar. The door shut. The street vanished behind tinted glass. For a moment no one spoke. The convoy pulled away from the curb with smooth, practiced motion. Baltimore began to slide past in wet brick and traffic lights and corner stores just opening for the day. Claire sat rigid hands clasped too tightly in her lap. At last, she said, You said the president requested me. Why? Agent Collins looked forward, not at her. You will be briefed upon arrival. You keep saying versions of that. Yes, ma'am. Frustration sharpened her voice. I saved a patient last night. I got fired for it. Now, Secret Service is driving me out of the city. You can understand why I would like 1 straight sentence. For the first time he met her eyes. You are not under investigation. She held his gaze. That was not the sentence I asked for. No, ma'am. She looked away first. The SUV merged onto the highway, the convoy surrounding them with quiet authority. No sirens. No flashing lights. Just lanes opening, as if traffic itself sensed the kind of people inside those vehicles and preferred not to question them. Baltimore receded behind them. Industrial cranes and harbor stacks gave way to long gray stretches of road and wet winter trees. Rain tapped occasionally against the windows. The heater hummed low. Somewhere in the distance, a helicopter crossed the sky dark against thinning clouds. Claire pressed her fingers to the dog tag in her pocket until the edges bit lightly into her palm. She thought about calling her mother, then imagined the conversation and stopped. Thought about texting Marlene, then stopped. Thought about asking again and understood from Agent Collins' face that she would gain nothing but repetition. So she sat with the silence. The highway signs changed mile by mile. Washington, Capitol Beltway. Federal exits. The closer they got, the less her mind obeyed sequence. It jumped instead. Judith's office. Her father's photograph. The Marine's eyes opening for that one impossible second. Mercer. The name kept returning with the heavy pressure of meaning just out of reach. By the time the first DC monuments appeared in the distance through the rain-washed glass, her heartbeat had moved from fear into something stranger. Dislocation. As if she had left her own life somewhere on the shoulder of the interstate and was now traveling farther from it with every exit. The convoy left the main traffic flow and entered a cleaner, quieter world of official buildings, barriers, cameras, and practice security. Agents spoke into radios. Gates opened. Uniformed officers glanced at plates and waved them through with immediate recognition. Claire turned her head to watch it all. The choreography of power, no wasted movement, no uncertainty. Everything in Washington seemed built to suggest that someone somewhere had already decided how events should unfold. The convoy slowed at last. Then the White House came into view. Claire had seen it before, the way everyone had seen it. In textbooks, on television, in films that made it look larger or whiter or more symbolic than any real building could bear. In person it was stranger, not unreal exactly, more concentrated than reality. A place ordinary enough to have windows and gutters and doors, yet so burdened with history and decision that even from the car it seemed to pull gravity inward. The SUVs rolled to a stop. Claire realized she had stopped breathing properly and let the air out in a slow, shaky line. Agent Collins stepped out first. Another opened her door. Cold DC air reached in. Miss Donovan. She got out. The gravel beneath her shoes sounded too loud. The lawn beyond stretched green despite the weather manicured in a way no public ground ever was. Staff moved at a distance with the brisk economy of people used to urgency and watched from all angles. Everything gleamed, everything listened. Claire adjusted the strap of her bag and tried not to look like someone who had been fired less than 12 hours ago. Inside the White House was quieter than any hospital and somehow more charged. The floors shone. Portraits watched. Every footstep echoed in a language of marble and old power. 2 staffers met her near the entrance and took over from the agents. They were polite, efficient, unreadable. "This way, Miss Donovan." She followed. Through corridor after corridor, past rooms she recognized only because the country had seen them in moments of celebration, mourning, law war, scandal, ceremony. The place smelled faintly of wax paper and expensive air. Somewhere far off a clock chimed the quarter hour. Claire's hand brushed the dog tag in her pocket again. Still there. Still real. They stopped at a set of tall double doors. One of the staffers turned to her and lowered his voice, the first real softness she had encountered since the knock at her apartment. "He is ready for you now." Then he opened the door. The room beyond was larger than Claire expected, and quieter than seemed possible for a place where the country made decisions that touched millions of lives. Morning light filtered through tall windows and spread in soft bands across polished floors. Flags stood in still corners. Framed paintings watched from the walls with the patient indifference of history. At the far end of the room, near the resolute desk, stood a man Claire had seen 1,000 times on screens and magazine covers, and hospital waiting room televisions mounted too high on the wall. In person, President Elias Mercer looked less like an image and more like a man who had not slept. He turned as the doors closed behind her. For one suspended second, neither of them moved. Then he crossed part of the distance between them and stopped. "Miss Donovan," he said. His voice was steady low, not loud enough to fill a room by force, and not weak enough to need it. It was a voice trained by years of pressure, but something in it had changed overnight. The public tone was still there, but beneath it was another one. A private strain. The rough edge of a father who had spent too many hours waiting beside a phone. Claire swallowed. "Mr. President." He studied her face with a kind of quiet intensity that made her aware of every detail she could not hide. The exhaustion in her eyes. The faint bruise on her wrist. The fact that she still looked more like a nurse between shifts than a guest of the White House. He gestured toward a chair near the desk. "Please, sit." Claire sat because standing felt impossible, and because every instinct in her body had become very simple over the past 12 hours. Conserve energy. Read the room. Keep breathing. The president remained standing for another moment, one hand resting lightly on the back of the chair across from her. Not a theatrical pause, a gathering one. When he finally sat, he leaned forward, forearms on his knees, and looked at her directly. "I want to begin by thanking you for coming on such short notice." Claire almost laughed at the phrase, short notice, as though this had been a scheduling inconvenience rather than a convoy at her apartment door. Instead, she said, "I was told it was urgent." It was. Silence settled between them. Not hostile, not comfortable. A silence held up by the weight of what he knew and what she did not. Claire felt the dog tag in her pocket like a second pulse. The president saw her glance downward. His eyes followed the movement for a fraction of a second, then returned to her face. "You still have it," he said. Claire's hand moved instinctively over her coat pocket, the tag. He nodded once. She drew in a careful breath. "It ended up in my scrub pocket during the transfer. I should have turned it over." "No," he said quietly. "I think it stayed with the right person." Something in the room shifted with that sentence. Not revelation yet, but close. Close enough that the air seemed to tighten around it. Claire looked at him more sharply. He held her gaze. "You saved my son." The words entered her body before they entered her mind. For a moment, they seemed too large to fit anywhere. They passed through her like cold water, and left every thought behind them, shivering into place. "My son." Claire stared at him. The president continued, but gently now, as if he understood that meaning sometimes arrived in pieces. "Lance Corporal Logan Mercer, United States Marine Corps." Mercer. The name struck full force this time. The tag in her pocket. The federal silence. The people at the harbor scene. The urgency wrapped in secrecy. Her mouth parted, but nothing came out. The president did not rush her. At last, Claire managed, "I did not know." "I know." His answer came without accusation, without performance, just fact. "I did not know who he was," she said again, because somehow that felt like the most important thing to make clear. The president nodded. "That is why you are in this room." Claire looked at him, still trying to reconcile the man in front of her with the unconscious Marine under the trauma lights. It was there now that she knew where to look. The structure around the eyes. The line of the jaw under strain. Not identical, but related enough that she could not understand how she had missed it. Then again, there had been so much blood, so much swelling, so little time. "He was found near the shipping yard," she said almost to herself. The president's expression tightened slightly. "Yes." Was he deployed? He was returning through a secure corridor connected to an ongoing operation. The answer was precise and incomplete. A line drawn around what he would say and what he would not. Claire accepted that immediately. She was too tired to chase classified edges. He was in bad shape. At that, something openly pained crossed the president's face. Not the controlled public sorrow he wore at memorials and press briefings. Something older and simpler. We were told there had been an attack. We were told he might not make it to a trauma center. Claire lowered her eyes for one moment. When she looked back up, he was still watching her. "I reviewed the footage from Harborview," he said. Her spine went still. "I read the incident reports. I spoke to people in your emergency department. I know what happened in that room. I know what did not happen in that room. I know who hesitated. I know who acted." Claire said nothing. Not because she was intimidated. Because anything she said would have broken under the pressure in her chest. The president leaned back, but only slightly. "You had no reason to believe my son was anyone but a wounded Marine with no identification and minutes left. You were told to stand down. You were told to wait. You chose not to." The room seemed very quiet around those words. Claire heard her own voice as if from farther away. He was dying. "Yes, I did what anyone should have done." That earned the faintest shift in his expression. Not disagreement exactly. More a tired recognition that the country often depended on the fact that not everyone did what they should. "No," he said. "You did what very few people are willing to do when the cost arrives in advance." Claire looked down at her hands. The skin over her knuckles was still red from repeated washing. Tiny cracks had formed where the soap and antiseptic had stripped moisture away. Her hands looked exactly like what they were. Working hands. Hands that had held pressure against a chest while blood escaped around her fingers. Hands that had gone home jobless. Her throat tightened. I was fired this morning. The president exhaled once through his nose. I know. There was no surprise in his voice. That hurt in a different way. As though even at this level of power the pattern was familiar enough to be expected. Before Claire could answer, the door behind her opened softly. She turned. A woman entered the room with the same measured grace Claire had seen from a distance in state dinners and official photographs. But whatever public poise usually accompanied First Lady Caroline Mercer had been overtaken by something more human. She was elegantly dressed, her posture perfect, yet her face told the truth before she spoke. She looked like a mother who had spent the night bargaining with every god she had ever doubted. The First Lady crossed the room without hesitation. Claire rose automatically. For one helpless second she did not know what protocol required. Whether to step back, extend a hand, speak first. The First Lady made the decision for both of them. She took Claire's hands in hers. Her grip was warm, firm, and unceremonious. Not the touch of a figure greeting a stranger for cameras. The touch of someone reaching for the person who had returned a life to her family. "Thank you," she said. 2 simple words. But they carried no polish, no script. They trembled with the force of everything she had not said yet. Claire felt heat rise suddenly behind her eyes. The First Lady looked down at Claire's hands, at the fading signs of the night still written in the skin, and her own expression tightened. "These are the hands that held him." Claire's voice broke before she could stop it. "We all worked on him." The First Lady lifted her gaze. "But you were the one who refused to let them wait." That landed somewhere deep and unprotected. Claire had spent the entire drive to Washington bracing for accusation or explanation or some administrative exchange at a level larger than Harborview. She had not prepared for gratitude this direct, this personal, this impossible to hide from. The president stood and moved closer, remaining just enough apart to let the moment belong to his wife. "We had been preparing ourselves," the First Lady said quietly, for a very different morning. Claire could not find language strong enough to answer that, so she said the only true thing she had. "I am sorry for what happened to him." The First Lady closed her eyes briefly, then opened them again. "So are we." For a moment, the 3 of them stood there, joined not by office or status but by a single body under hard white light in Baltimore, alive, because fear had not won the room. The First Lady released Claire's hands only to touch her forearm once lightly, as if to make certain she was real. "Please sit," she said. This time, the First Lady took the chair beside the president, while Claire sat across from them. The geometry of the room changed with that. It no longer felt like she was in a formal audience. It felt as if she had been drawn into the private center of a family catastrophe and asked to witness its aftermath. The president reached to the desk and lifted a slim folder. "I wanted to speak to you before any statement was made publicly," he said. Claire focused on the folder, not on the seal, not on the implication, just on the shape, because small shapes were easier than large realities. "There will be a statement." "Yes." Her body tensed. "About him. About you." That startled a small laugh out of her, though it held no humor. "I am not sure that is a good idea." The president looked at her with open curiosity. "Why not?" Claire did not answer right away. She felt too exposed in that room for easy diplomacy. "Because I am tired. Because I have not slept. Because my career was cut out from under me less than a day ago. Because there are people in Baltimore right now deciding how to write me into a version of this story that makes them feel cleaner. Because I do not know how to stand in front of cameras when my hands still remember his pulse leaving." What she said instead was, "I am a nurse." The president's expression softened, but he did not let her hide inside the sentence. "You are," he said. "And last night you were also something else. You were the only person in a room full of trained professionals who understood that delay was another name for surrender." Claire inhaled slowly. That is not how it will look to everyone. The First Lady answered this time. No, she said, it never does. The room went quiet again. Then the President set the folder on the desk between them and opened it. Inside were printed stills from hospital surveillance footage. Grainy overhead images. Time-stamped. Clinical. Unforgiving. Claire saw herself in the frame, shoulders squared beside the gurney, one arm outstretched toward the trauma bay 3 while others remained still around her. Another image showed the trauma team clustered over the bed. Another showed Judith in the doorway. Seeing herself from above made her feel briefly unmoored, like she was watching a stranger make the decision that had detonated her life. I asked for every angle, the President said. Claire looked up. I did not want anyone telling me a version polished by fear or legal language. I wanted to see what happened. Her gaze moved back to the stills. The overhead camera did not capture the smell of blood or the strain in Marlene's voice, or the exact second her own pulse had turned into a drumbeat behind her eyes. But it showed enough. It showed motion where others paused. It showed pressure against the wound. It showed the shape of refusal. I am not interested, the President said in rewarding spectacle. I am interested in truth. That sentence did something to the room. It cleared it. Claire looked at him more steadily now. He closed the folder. The truth is that my son is alive because you acted when it was easier and safer for others not to. The First Lady's voice came low beside him. And because of that, our family is still a family. Claire's composure gave way at that, not dramatically. No sobs, no collapse. Just 2 tears she had not given herself permission to shed since the night began sliding free despite her effort to hold them back. She looked down at once, ashamed of them. The First Lady passed her a handkerchief without a word. Claire took it with fingers that had gone unsteady again. I am sorry. For what? Claire gave a breath that almost broke into a laugh. Apparently for everything today. That drew the first real smile from the First Lady, fragile but genuine. The President let the silence breathe for a few more seconds before he stood. When he did, the air in the room shifted again from private disclosure toward consequence. There are members of the press assembled in the East Room, he said. They know only that there will be an announcement regarding an act of extraordinary service. Nothing more. Not yet. Claire rose too quickly and had to steady herself. Now, yes. The handkerchief was still in her fingers. She folded it carefully, buying herself 1 extra second. I am not dressed for this. The First Lady stood and looked her over with a kind of maternal amusement that cut through the tension. You are dressed like the woman who saved my son. Claire almost answered, but the First Lady's expression stopped her. There was no performance in it. No sentimental inflation. Just fierce certainty. One of the aides entered quietly at the President's signal. In his hands was a dark navy blazer. Another carried a small box and a folder embossed with the presidential seal. The First Lady took the blazer and held it out. Here. Claire slipped her arms into it. It fit well enough to feel intentional. The fabric was heavier than anything in her own closet. Clean, structured, it transformed her appearance just enough to move her from exhausted civilian to somebody the room could read as belonging there, even if she still felt like a nurse in borrowed air. The President waited until she had adjusted the cuffs. Miss Donovan, he said, and then paused. Claire looked up. In a few minutes, this country is going to see you. I would prefer they see you clearly. No one had said words like that to her in a very long time. Not at Harborview. Not in any staff review or annual evaluation or exhausted after-shift conversation. Nurses were often praised in general and overlooked in detail. Useful, admired, underpaid, exhausted, and somehow expected to absorb invisibility as part of the profession. Claire held the edge of the desk lightly with one hand. I still do not know what to say. The President's face relaxed by 1 degree. Then say very little. Truth does not require much decoration. The walk to the East Room felt unreal from the first step. Staffers moved ahead of them and behind them in soft, efficient currents. Doors opened as they approached. Portraits and chandeliers and polished surfaces slipped past in a blur that Claire's tired mind could not properly file. She remained aware of fragments only: the sound of her own shoes on the floor, the rustle of the First Lady's sleeve, the weight of the dog tag in her pocket, the strange nearness of presidential security always present and almost invisible until you tried not to think about it. At the entrance to the East Room they stopped. The murmur from inside was unmistakable. Journalists, camera crews, the dense, low electricity of people who sensed news before they knew its exact shape. An aide leaned into the president and spoke quietly. He nodded. Claire stood very still. The First Lady stepped closer to her and adjusted the lapel of the blazer with her own hands. "You do not need to be anyone else in there," she said. "Do you understand me?" Claire nodded. The doors opened. Light struck first, then sound. The East Room was full. Reporters in neat rows, cameras mounted and waiting, white walls, gold drapes. The presidential seal, every surface carrying that ceremonial brightness official spaces used to suggest order, even when the truth beneath them was raw. When the president entered the room, rose in a wave. Camera shutters started at once, quick and relentless as rain on glass. Claire's instincts screamed at her to retreat to the wall, to become useful in the background, to let other people take center frame. Nurses were trained to orient toward the patient, not the podium. But there was nowhere to retreat to now. The president moved to the podium. The First Lady stood to one side. Claire remained just behind, and to his left, hands lightly clasped to stop them shaking. The room settled. The president looked out across the rows of reporters and began. Last night in Baltimore, a United States Marine arrived at Harborview Regional Trauma Center in critical condition after sustaining severe injuries connected to an ongoing federal matter. He arrived without identification and with almost no time left. The room had gone so still that Claire could hear the distant click of a camera being adjusted somewhere near the back wall. The president continued. In that emergency room, while confusion spread and authority hesitated, one trauma nurse made a decision. She chose to act. She chose to treat. She chose a dying man over delay. A ripple moved through the press rows. Pens lifted, eyes sharpened. Claire felt heat rise along her neck. Because of that choice, the president said that Marlene is alive today. He turned then and looked directly at her before facing the room again. "His name is Lance Corporal Logan Mercer. He is my son." The room exploded. Not in noise at first, because trained reporters knew how to hold silence long enough for revelation to land, but visually. Heads turning, notes flying, cameras firing in a storm of shutters so dense the air itself seemed to flicker. Claire remained perfectly still because she had forgotten how else to stand. The president lifted one hand and the room quieted enough for him to go on. Nurse Claire Donovan did not know his identity. She did not know his name. She did not know his family. She knew only what every honest clinician knows when life is leaving a room: that waiting has a cost. She acted with skill, courage, and conscience when doing so put her own standing at risk. His voice hardened slightly on the next sentence. This morning she was terminated by her employer for that decision. This time the room did react audibly. A stunned intake of breath from somewhere near the center. The rapid, dry scratching of notes. The sudden collective realization that the story was larger than gratitude. It contained injustice, and injustice always sharpened national attention. The president reached to the aide beside him, who handed him the box Claire had seen earlier in the office. He opened it. Inside, resting against dark velvet, was a medal that caught the light in a quiet blaze. For extraordinary service to another human being in a moment of profound risk, the president said, "It is my honor to award Nurse Claire Donovan the Presidential Citizen's Medal." Claire heard the words, but needed an extra second to understand that the people around her were turning, slightly making space, waiting for her to step forward. The First Lady touched her arm gently. Claire moved. Her legs felt at once too heavy and not entirely connected to her body. She crossed the small distance to the president, stopped where indicated by instinct more than thought, and lifted her chin because she had no other defense against shaking. The president took the medal from its case and placed it around her neck. The weight of it surprised her. Not enormous, but real. Enough to make the moment unavoidable. Camera flashes burst white against her vision. The president said quietly so only she could hear stand tall. Claire did. The First Lady's eyes shone openly now. The room was applauding. A formal sound at first, then warmer, less restrained, as even the people tasked with neutrality gave in to the simple force of the scene before them. Claire looked out once and saw faces blurred by light and distance. Journalists, staff, officials, strangers. A country reduced to a room. She did not know how long the applause lasted. Only that when it finally softened, she was still standing there with the medal resting against borrowed navy fabric and her own life no longer recognizable. The president returned to the podium but did not close the folder on it. "There is one further matter," he said. The room sharpened again. The president looked toward Claire with that same steady gravity he had held in the office. "This administration has no interest in allowing courage to be punished and then politely admired from a distance. Effective immediately, and with her consent, Claire Donovan is hereby appointed to the White House Medical Unit as Director of Emergency Nursing Operations." That hit the room harder than the medal had. Somebody near the front actually whispered, "My God." Camera shutters accelerated all over again. Questions began to surge though they were not yet permitted voice. Claire stared at the president. For one helpless second she truly thought she had misheard. The First Lady leaned toward her, smiling through tears now. "You heard him." Claire gave the smallest disbelieving shake of her head. "I am not even employed right now." The president's mouth shifted almost into a smile. "That can be corrected." A few soft laughs broke through the room. Human ones. Relieved ones. Claire looked from him to the First Lady and back again. This was too much, too public, too fast. Her instincts rebelled. Nurses did not get plucked out of ruined mornings and installed into the White House. Real life did not move on ceremonial tracks. Real life staggered, bled, and doubled back. Yet the room around her was painfully real. The First Lady took her hand once more. "You saved a life because you knew exactly what your job required. We are asking you to bring that clarity here." The president added, "I am not offering you charity, Ms. Donovan. I am asking for your service." That changed the shape of it. Not reward, not compensation, a request framed in duty. Claire could breathe inside duty. Still, her voice came out almost inaudible. "I do not know what to say." The president regarded her for a long second. "Then tell us the truth." He stepped aside from the podium. The room waited. Claire looked at the podium as if it might belong to another species. Then she stepped toward it because every exit now lay behind her, and because something in the way he had said truth made retreat impossible. She rested both hands lightly on either side of the podium. The microphone waited. So did the nation, though she could not allow herself to think in terms that large. She looked once at the medal resting against her chest. Then she looked up. "I did what I was trained to do," she said. Her voice sounded steadier than she felt. "I saw a patient in front of me. He was dying. I did not know his name. I did not know who his family was. I only knew there was no time." A camera clicked somewhere to her right. Then another. Claire kept going. There were other people in that room who worked just as hard to keep him here. I was not alone in that. But I was the one who moved first. She paused not for effect, but because the truth hurt on its way out. And this morning, I was told that choice cost me my career. The room held still. Claire glanced once toward the First Lady, then toward the President. Standing here now, I do not feel vindicated as much as I feel grateful. Grateful that he is alive. Grateful that his family still has him. Grateful that what happened in that room is being seen clearly. She stopped there because anything more ornate would have betrayed her. For a moment, nobody moved. Then the applause returned stronger this time because it had chosen her not just as the subject of the story but as its voice. Questions were called as soon as the president signaled for a brief press availability. Mr. President, was Harborview ordered to delay care? Will there be a federal inquiry into the termination? Ms. Donovan, would you make the same choice again? The room came alive with overlapping urgency. It was a different kind of chaos than the trauma bay, but chaos all the same. Need colliding with speed, bodies leaning forward, stakes measured in seconds and sentences. The president answered the institutional questions with controlled firmness. There would be a full review. The facts would be established. Patient care under emergent conditions would not be subordinated to bureaucratic confusion. When one reporter asked Claire directly whether she regretted anything, she answered without looking down, "I regret that there was ever a debate." That line went through the room like a blade. More questions followed, but the staff began closing the availability before the press could fully devour the scene. The East Room shifted toward movement and sound again as aides guided people back, redirected, ended. Only when the formal part had broken apart did Claire realize how exhausted she truly was. Adrenaline had carried her from Baltimore to this room, but now that the speech and revelation and flash of cameras had passed, the fatigue returned in a wave that made the floor feel uncertain under her feet. The First Lady saw it instantly. She stepped close and lowered her voice, "Come with me." The president touched Claire lightly at the elbow as they turned away from the podium. "Logan is still in intensive care," he said. "He is stable." Claire let out a breath she had not known she was holding. "Thank you." The president shook his head once. "No, thank you." They moved through a side exit rather than back through the center aisle. The corridor beyond was dimmer, quieter, almost shockingly so, after the barrage of light and attention. The First Lady led her into a smaller private sitting room with cream walls, a low fire laid but not lit, and windows looking out onto a rain-bright lawn. An aide entered with water and then withdrew. Claire sat without being asked this time. Her whole body seemed suddenly aware of itself again. The ache in her back, the weight of the metal, the stiffness in her shoulders, the fact that she had not eaten anything substantial since the night before. The First Lady handed her a glass. Claire drank half of it in one pull. When she lowered the glass, the president was standing near the window, one hand in his pocket looking out into the wet morning. Without turning, he said he asked for you. Claire looked up. What? When he surfaced briefly in the ICU, he did not have all of his bearings, but he remembered enough. He said there was a nurse. He wanted to know whether you were all right. Something inside Claire shifted and softened so suddenly it almost hurt. The First Lady sat beside her. He has always been impossible that way. Claire let out a tired breath that might have been a laugh. He thanked me. The First Lady turned toward her surprised. In the trauma bay. Claire nodded. The president looked back from the window, and for the first time since she had entered the White House, there was an unmistakable warmth in his face. That sounds like him. They let the moment sit. Rain traced the glass outside in thin silver lines. Somewhere farther down the hall, footsteps passed and faded. The country was still moving beyond these walls. Calls being made. Stories breaking. Names spreading. Harborview likely erupting under a pressure it had not anticipated. But inside that small room, for a few rare minutes, none of it mattered more than the plain living fact of Logan Mercer's pulse continuing in a hospital bed. Claire set the glass down carefully. The metal rested heavy against her chest. The dog tag rested in her pocket beneath it. Above her hand, the blazer sleeve was still slightly too long. She had left Baltimore that morning, believing her life had narrowed into loss. Now, she sat in the White House with a mother who had thanked her through tears, a president who had asked for her service, and a future opening so abruptly she could not yet bear to look at it straight. The First Lady touched the edge of the metal with one fingertip, then let her hand fall. "You must be exhausted." Claire gave a small nod. "I am." The First Lady smiled gently. "Then, for the next hour, you will let us take care of you." Claire looked from her to the president, still unsure that any of this belonged to the same reality as Harborview before dawn. Yet the room was warm. The water was cold. The ache in her body was honest. And somewhere in intensive care, a Marine who had arrived nameless and dying was still alive enough to ask after the nurse who had refused to wait. For the first time since the ambulance doors had burst open in Baltimore, Claire allowed herself to sit inside that fact without bracing for what would be taken from her next. The quiet in that sitting room did not last long. By noon, Claire's name had crossed every network banner in the country. The nurse from Baltimore. The woman fired after saving a Marine, the one called to the White House. Her face, pulled from hospital records, and then from the East Room cameras, began appearing everywhere at once. On television screens in airport lounges, on phones held over coffee cups, in waiting rooms and break rooms and military family homes where strangers leaned closer and said her name like they had known it for years. The speed of it made her feel unreal. One moment she was in a borrowed blazer trying to keep her hands from shaking. The next staff in the West Wing were speaking to her with a measured respect that still felt meant for someone else. An aide handed her a temporary access credential. Another walked her through the private side of the medical unit. The office, she was shown, was compact, orderly, and quiet in a way no trauma nurse ever really trusted. Everything in it had been prepared quickly but carefully. Fresh files, a desk lamp already switched on, a stethoscope in a presentation case she had not asked for and did not touch. Claire stood in the doorway and took it in. This was the kind of room where decisions were made before emergencies reached the floor. The kind of place built to prevent chaos rather than survive it. That was new to her. Hospitals like Harborview were where chaos arrived first and explanations limped in afterward. By late afternoon, the first wave of public praise had already met its shadow. A communications aide tried gently to suggest she avoid reading anything online. Claire agreed. Then, later that evening, alone in the residence assigned to her for the night, she read some anyway. Hero. Patriot. Angel in Scrubs. Then the other side. Lucky nurse. Media invention. Grandstanding opportunist. If the patient had been ordinary, nobody would care. Claire locked her phone and set it face down on the bedside table. The words should not have mattered. She knew that, but exhaustion stripped people down to their least defended parts, and the comments found those parts easily. They did not know the smell of that trauma bay. They did not know what panic sounded like under fluorescent lights, or how long a second could become when a pulse disappeared under your fingers. They knew the polished version now. The medal, the podium, the president's voice. They had not seen the blood on her shoes. The next morning, she reported to the White House medical unit before sunrise. Old habits did not disappear for new titles. A senior physician named Dr. Miriam Keene met her just inside the secure entrance. She was in her 60s, silver-haired, spare, composed, and possessed of the kind of calm that only came from decades spent around people whose mistakes made headlines. She did not waste time offering ceremony. "You had a difficult day." Claire almost smiled. That is one way to describe it. Dr. Keene studied her for a moment. "The cameras will make this harder than the medicine. The medicine you already understand." That was the first thing anyone had said to her since Baltimore that felt like solid ground. Claire followed her through the clinic, exam rooms, emergency supply stations, a compact trauma room designed not for volume but for speed. Equipment was tucked with military precision behind labeled panels. Every inch of the place, Ashish spoke the language of preparedness. Not improvisation, not scarcity. Preparedness. Dr. Keene stopped near a wall map marked with evacuation routes and emergency contingencies. "The White House does not function like a city hospital," she said. "But bodies fail here too. Hearts misfire, airways close. People faint, panic, choke, bleed, hide symptoms, lie about symptoms, and pretend they are stronger than they are. Power changes none of that." Claire looked around. "Good." Dr. Keene raised an eyebrow. "Good. I would not know what to do in a place where anatomy took requests." That earned the smallest nod of approval. The first week passed in long controlled days. Claire learned secure procedures, emergency chains, and the choreography of care inside a place built around protection. She reviewed medication protocols with Secret Service medics. She walked through active shooter contingencies and mass casualty response plans no one liked naming aloud. She observed before she changed anything, but she observed closely. By the end of the second week, people in the unit had stopped looking at her like a headline and started looking at her like a colleague, not all at once. Respect rarely arrived in dramatic fashion among medical staff. It came through repeated competence, through the answer given fast and correctly, through the hand that stayed steady, through the lack of fuss when pressure rose. One afternoon, a junior nurse froze during a syncopal episode involving a visiting senator who was more embarrassed than endangered. Claire stepped in, lowered the patient to the floor before he could strike his head, directed the room with clean, efficient commands, and had the situation under control before panic could find a foothold. Later in the supply room, the junior nurse stood by the cabinet, twisting the cap off a water bottle she did not drink. "I am sorry," she said. "I should have moved faster." Claire leaned against the shelf across from her. "You moved eventually. That is not the same thing." "No." Claire's voice softened. "But it is the part you build from." The younger woman looked up. "Were you ever like that?" Claire thought of Harborview, of her first year, of the way fear used to feel like heat trapped under her collar. "Yes," she said, "and nobody gets better by pretending they arrived calm." Words spread through the unit in ways words always did. Quietly. Efficiently. By the end of the month, Claire belonged there enough that people asked for her judgment before they asked for her story. Then Logan Mercer walked into her office. It was just after 10 on a Tuesday morning. Claire was standing over a briefing binder marking revisions to a trauma response checklist when she heard a knuckle tap once against the open door. She looked up. For a second, the image did not settle. The man in the doorway was broad-shouldered and upright, dressed in full marine blues, one hand at his side, the other resting lightly against the frame. The swelling was gone. The bruising had faded. A pale scar climbed just above the edge of his collar, disappearing beneath the fabric. He was leaner than he should have been, recovery still written in the face, if you knew where to look, but indisputably alive. Alive in a way hospital memory had not prepared her for. His mouth shifted into the faintest, crooked smile. "Permission to enter, ma'am." Claire stared at him another beat, then let out a breath that turned into a laugh before she could stop it. "You are asking permission now." He stepped inside, trying to make a good impression. He stopped in front of her desk. Up close, she could see the remnants of pain beneath the polish, the controlled way he held his left side, the slight caution in his posture when he turned. He was healed enough to stand tall, not healed enough to forget. Claire set the pen down. "You should be in physical therapy." "I was. And now." I had a gap in the schedule. That made her smile properly for the first time in days. For a moment, neither of them said anything. The office held them in a strange, private stillness. Two people tied together by the most violent night of one of their lives, now standing under calm light with polished wood between them. Logan reached into his pocket and placed a small brass challenge coin on the desk. "My unit had this made after the operation." He glanced at it, then back at her. "I wanted you to have one." Claire touched the edge of the coin with one fingertip, but did not pick it up yet. "You do realize I was not actually in your unit." He met her eyes. "You were when it mattered." Something tightened in her throat. She looked away for a second, gathered herself, then looked back. "How much do you remember?" "Fragments." He gave a small shrug. "Rain, metal, then the hospital lights. I remember a voice arguing with somebody. I remember waking up long enough to think an angel looked extremely irritated." Claire laughed despite herself. "That sounds more accurate than flattering." "It kept me alive." He said it simply, not as praise, as fact. Silence passed between them again, but this time it was easier. Then Logan asked, "Why did you do it?" The question was not theatrical. It was quiet, earnest. He wanted the truth beneath the cameras, beneath the speeches, beneath the medals and headlines. Claire leaned back slightly in her chair. "Because you were dying," she said. because nobody in that room could guarantee they would sleep again if they let that happen while waiting for permission. Because there are moments when the rule in front of you and the duty in front of you are not the same thing. Logan lowered his gaze for 1 second, then nodded. My mother said you never once asked who I was. I did not have time. He looked up with a shadow of something deeper in his expression now. Gratitude, certainly. But also the burden survivors often carried when they had returned by inches while others had not. I have thought about that a lot, he said. That you saved me before my name could matter. Claire understood then that what he needed from her was not just thanks exchanged politely across a desk. He needed that fact kept clean, so she gave it to him. Your name mattered to your family, she said. It mattered later. In that room, your pulse mattered first. Logan let out a breath and nodded once more. Some private tension in him seemed to settle. Before he left, he glanced at the temporary office around her. You look strange behind a desk. I know. Good. After he was gone, Claire picked up the challenge coin and turned it over in her hand for a long time. That night, instead of going straight back to the residence, she drove herself to Baltimore. She did not tell anyone except the duty security liaison who disliked the unscheduled trip and approved it anyway after a brief, tense exchange with protocol. By the time she parked across from Harborview, the city had gone dark around the edges. Ambulance lights pulsed red and blue against the wet pavement near the bay. The hospital looked exactly as it always had. Impersonal from the outside. Hungry from within. Claire sat in the car for a while with the engine off. Then she went inside wearing a plain coat and no visible insignia. The emergency department smelled the same. Antiseptic. Coffee. Fatigue. Time had moved forward, but not enough to erase the texture of the place. She stayed near the walls watching. A triage nurse she did not know argued gently with a man insisting chest pain was just indigestion. A tech wheeled a monitor past. A toddler screamed from behind a curtain. Near the nurse's station, a young nurse was struggling to place a line in a dehydrated patient, while family members crowded too close, and fear made her hands clumsy. Claire recognized the look instantly. The inward spiral. The sense that everyone could see you coming apart. She stepped forward before deciding to. Rotate your wrist, she said softly. The nurse looked up, startled. Anchor higher. There. The young woman obeyed. The line slipped in cleanly. For 1 second, their eyes met in shared relief. Then the nurse looked again, recognition dawning too slowly to stop. Claire was already stepping back. She left before anyone could gather around her, before the old walls could decide what version of her they remembered. Out in the parking lot, she stood in the cold and understood with painful clarity what still pulled at her. It was not nostalgia. It was obligation. A month later, with Dr. Keene's quiet support and the First Lady's discreet backing, Claire established a scholarship and mentorship initiative for nursing students, combat medics transitioning to civilian care, and emergency trainees from underfunded backgrounds. She refused to put her own name on it. The program would stand on purpose, not celebrity. Applications began arriving in stacks. Late at night, after the clinic had quieted and the White House corridors had gone soft with polished silence, Claire read them one by one. Stories of debt, night shifts, parents working 2 jobs, veterans trying to translate battlefield skill into hospital language, young people who knew exactly what it meant to want to help and not know if the world would make room for them. She wrote notes in the margins, asked follow-up questions, chose mentors carefully, paid attention. The work steadied her. So did the final ceremony that spring when the first cohort gathered on the south lawn under pale sunlight and moving flags. Rows of nervous recruits sat facing the podium, hands folded too tightly in their laps. Claire stood at the side of the stage with a clipboard in hand, listening to the low, pre-event murmur of a room trying not to become a crowd. Then Logan appeared in dress blues and the mood shifted. He crossed the lawn with full confidence, now no visible trace of the man who had once arrived at Harborview fighting for air. When he reached the stage, he turned first not to the podium but to Claire. and saluted. The gesture was clean, personal, and exact. The audience rose in a wave. Claire felt the force of the moment hit her all at once. Not the cameras, not the applause, the circle of it. The impossible path from Trauma Bay 3 to this bright open lawn. When her turn came to speak, she stepped to the microphone and looked out at the young faces waiting in front of her. "You will be tired," she said. "You will be uncertain. Some days the right decision will ask more of you than you feel you have. Make it anyway, then keep going." That was all. It was enough. Later that evening, back in her office, the building finally quiet. Claire set the challenge coin beside the dog tag on her desk. L. Mercer, USMC, a small brass circle from his unit, her White House badge. 3 objects. 3 versions of the same truth. She sat down and looked through the window at the darkening lawn beyond the glass. Somewhere in the residence, staff were closing down another day. Somewhere in Baltimore, Harborview's ambulance doors were opening and closing under fluorescent light. Somewhere across the country, one of her scholarship letters was being opened by a pair of hands that did not yet know a life could change in a single room. Claire rested her fingertips on the dog tag once, then let her hand fall still. The night at Harborview had taken her old life apart with surgical precision. What remained had not become easier, only clearer.